The screen is dark, just a faint hum of anticipation. Then a line cuts through, quietly, almost too softly to hear. What if everything you thought you knew was only part of the story? And in that silence, the question lingers. It's a simple phrase, but one that has, quietly, rippled through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, across the quiet halls of Frogmore Cottage, and into the whispers of royal insiders. Tonight, we pull back the curtain. Tonight, we trace the tremors caused by a revelation so explosive that it has left one of the most public figures in the world scrambling to control a narrative that feels, increasingly, out of reach. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry has always lived under the unrelenting gaze of the public eye. Every smile scrutinized, every word parsed, every decision questioned. But rarely has that spotlight shone so sharply on something so deeply personal. A new claim has surfaced, one that challenges long-held perceptions, and it comes from a source with a reputation for digging where others won't, Tom Bower. A man who has chronicled scandals, unearthed secrets, and left no stone unturned. And now, his latest revelation strikes at the very heart of Harry's private life. Lilibet, his youngest daughter, may not be who the world has been led to believe. In fact, according to this shocking leak, she was adopted. The word hangs in the air like a storm cloud, heavy, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. But let's pause. What does that even mean? Adoption is not inherently scandalous. Countless families navigate it with quiet dignity. Yet in this context, it's seismic. The revelation doesn't just touch on family dynamics. It intersects with power, legacy, public perception, and decades of careful media management. For Harry, who has navigated a world defined by rules he never wrote, whose every move is interpreted through a prism of expectation and tradition, the implications are immediate, personal, and unrelenting. And then there's the timing. Why now? Why this leak, and why from Tom Bower? Bower's reporting is meticulous, often painstakingly sourced, and his books have a way of reshaping narratives the moment they land. His credibility carries weight. It is the kind of weight that can cause boardroom whispers in the offices of tabloid editors, hurried memos at Palace Communications, and private conversations behind closed doors in Hollywood estates where Harry and Meghan have built new lives. The questions pile up. Who else knew? Who approved this revelation being released? And what is Harry's response? Or more tellingly, what hasn't he said? The story begins long before any book, any leak, any public announcement. It begins in the private spaces few have seen, in the corridors of Frogmore Cottage where laughter and lullabies mix with anxiety and concern. It begins in a world where Harry and Meghan attempted to carve out a life away from royal protocol, yet never fully escaped its shadow. Every decision, public or private, has been scrutinized, debated, and often weaponized. Adoption, in that context, is more than a family choice. It is a narrative bombshell. And in a world obsessed with pedigree, heritage, and lineage, the revelation strikes at identity itself. Consider the audience for a moment. You, watching now, are not just observing a family story. You are witnessing a collision of expectation and reality, power and vulnerability. What does it mean for the monarchy if the narrative of lineage is suddenly complicated? What does it mean for a prince who has spent years trying to reconcile his personal desires with inherited duty? And, perhaps most unsettlingly, what does it mean for the public perception of truth when even the most intimate details of a family's life are filtered through sources with agendas, biases, or, at minimum, sensational instincts? Tom Bower's claim is not just a statement, it is a challenge. It forces questions that can't easily be ignored. Was Lilibet adopted out of necessity? Protection? Privacy? Or was it something more strategic, a quiet move to shield her from the relentless glare of media scrutiny? And in that ambiguity lies the tension. Because when information is incomplete, speculation thrives. And for Harry, speculation is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous. There are whispers that this revelation has already caused ripples in relationships across continents. Advisors in Los Angeles reportedly convened in emergency meetings, debating messaging and damage control. Friends close to Harry have expressed shock, some disbelief, and others a cautious understanding that the exposure of such a secret could redefine personal and public narratives simultaneously. The layers are many, the implications intricate, and yet very few have publicly addressed it. Silence, in this context, is deafening. What complicates matters further is the intersection of media, privacy, and celebrity. Harry's life is not just personal. It is performative in ways few outside the palace walls can grasp. Every public appearance, every social media post, every carefully curated message carries with it the weight of expectation. The revelation of adoption isn't just a personal disclosure. It becomes a public text, one that will be dissected, debated, and debated again. And the role of Tom Bower is pivotal. As a journalist and biographer known for piercing investigations, his claim does not arrive as idle gossip, but as a documented assertion intended to provoke thought, discussion, and inevitably, headlines. Now, let's zoom in on the human element. Harry is, after all, a father. Lilibet, in many ways, is the axis around which the past few years have revolved. To imagine him confronting the possibility that aspects of her identity are being reinterpreted, weaponized, or misrepresented is to imagine a man navigating the delicate intersection of parental love, public expectation, and personal vulnerability. What does it feel like to have your child's very existence dissected in public, to have the choices you made as a parent subjected to analysis from people who will never understand the nuances, the reasoning, the heart behind those choices? And yet, Harry has always been a figure defined by action in the face of scrutiny. The Sussexes' move to North America was both bold and controversial, an attempt to redefine their narrative on their own terms. But the introduction of an adoption claim threatens to dismantle carefully constructed realities, forcing new strategies, new defenses, and perhaps new truths to be considered. How does one respond when a revelation is both intimate and globally consequential? When the stakes involve not just personal reputation, but the legacy of a family whose story is under constant surveillance. There is also the matter of timing in public perception. News cycles are fast, relentless, and unforgiving. In a world dominated by social media, every revelation is immediately magnified, distilled into hashtags, threads, and trending topics. For Harry, managing the fallout of such a claim is not a private affair. It is a performance in itself. The choices he makes, the words he does or does not say, the signals he sends, all are analyzed for subtext, intent, and emotion. It is a high-stakes landscape where the personal and political are inseparably intertwined. As we prepare to delve deeper, we must ask ourselves, how did this revelation emerge? What does it reveal about the inner workings of power, secrecy, and loyalty? And most importantly, what does it suggest about the lengths to which individuals will go to control narratives that touch both public image and private life? Because in this story, truth is not a simple commodity. It is layered, contested, and often obscured by the very forces that seek to define it. In the coming chapters, we will explore not only the origins of this claim, but its reverberations across family, media, and monarchy. We will examine the decisions that may have led to this point, the whispers that circulated behind closed doors, and the potential consequences that could unfold in ways few anticipate. Each revelation will build upon the last. Each contradiction will deepen the intrigue, and each question will lead to even more unsettling possibilities. By now, the scene is set. The question lingers. Adoption, a claim, Lilibet, and Harry, caught in the eye of a storm that refuses to abate. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. This marks the end of the introduction. The stage is set. The stakes are clear. The audience is left teetering between curiosity and disbelief, ready to follow the story into the labyrinthine chapters that lie ahead. What do you do when a secret you thought was unshakable suddenly surfaces in a book? When it is not just a rumor, but a carefully sourced claim, laid bare for the world to see? That is precisely the question facing Prince Harry today, as Tom Bower's latest revelations hit the public sphere with the subtlety of a thunderclap. The word adopted was enough to crack open a story that, until now, had remained tightly held behind palace walls and private residences. And yet, even as this claim makes headlines, the layers beneath it are far more complex, unsettling, and, at times, contradictory. The moment the leak broke, advisors reportedly scrambled. Not in a calm, methodical fashion, but in a rush fueled by urgency and unease. Sources close to the Sussexes described phone calls that lasted late into the night, whispered consultations, and tense meetings where every word was weighed for both truth and perception. Imagine being caught between the desire to protect your family's private life and the unrelenting public curiosity that demands answers you may not yet have. For Harry, this isn't hypothetical. It's immediate. But why now? Why would a revelation about Lilibet's adoption emerge at this precise moment? Timing, in matters of royal scrutiny, is never accidental. Bauer is meticulous. He builds narratives slowly, layers fact upon fact, and his work often surfaces at a juncture calculated to maximize impact. Was this leak coordinated, accidental, or something else entirely? And if it was coordinated, by whom? The palace? Media outlets? Or perhaps the leak originates not from those seeking scandal, but from those who believe in a version of transparency that is, frankly, devastatingly intrusive. There is a tension here that is almost unbearable. On one side, a father navigating the vulnerability of his child being publicly dissected. On the other, a global audience whose fascination with royal lineage and secrecy is insatiable. Consider the contradictions. Harry and Meghan moved to North America to escape scrutiny, yet their private decisions remain subject to relentless attention. The irony is palpable, almost cruel. The very act of seeking privacy magnifies public curiosity. Every subtle decision is dissected, every gesture interpreted, every absence noticed. And then there's the emotional weight. Adoption is more than a procedural fact. It is a deeply human, profoundly personal experience. In many families, adoption is an act of love, protection, and hope. But when placed under the public microscope of royalty, it becomes something else entirely, potentially fodder for controversy, speculation, and judgment. The question isn't simply whether Lilibet was adopted. It's why this matters, what it implies, and how it reframes Harry's life narrative. This leads to a second tension, credibility. Tom Bauer's name carries weight. He has unearthed secrets that others could not, and his reporting style is relentless, almost surgical. His books do not present wild conjecture. They document, source, and contextualize. That makes his claims about Lilibet particularly potent. A casual gossip column could be dismissed, but Bauer's investigation? That forces a reckoning. It forces advisors, friends, and family to confront questions they may have quietly avoided. And for Harry, it forces him to consider not just the public fallout, but the personal truth of what he has tried to protect for years. Yet even credibility is layered with complexity. Sources close to Bauer suggest he cross-references, verifies, and triangulates details meticulously. Still, there is a world of difference between documented evidence and interpretation. The line between reporting and narrative shaping is delicate, and in this case, it is razor-thin. Every assertion about Lilibet's adoption invites follow-up questions. What does adopted mean in this context? Legally? Emotionally? Symbolically? Is it a formal process, or a familial arrangement meant to shield her from public exposure? And crucially, what does Harry himself know, acknowledge, or wish to disclose? The implications for the Sussexes are enormous. Think about it. A family striving to balance private life and public responsibility suddenly faces a revelation that reframes personal identity, parental choices, and family structure. For the monarchy, it raises questions about transparency, lineage, and perception. And for the public, it forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about privacy, narrative control, and the way personal stories become commodities. Every layer of this revelation is fraught with tension, contradiction, and human complexity. And then there's the subtle, almost invisible factor, emotion. What is it like for Harry, caught between paternal instinct and public scrutiny? For Meghan, navigating the dual pressures of protecting her child and defending her family's narrative? These are not abstract concepts. They are lived realities. The weight of secrecy, the burden of protection, the anxiety of exposure, all converge in ways that are both intimate and inescapably public. And yet, very little is said. The silence itself becomes a signal, a statement, a choice that carries its own implications. At the heart of this chapter lies a paradox. The more Harry tries to maintain control over his family's narrative, the more fragile that control becomes. Each revelation, whether intentional or leaked, shifts perception, challenges assumptions, and forces reconsideration. Adoption, normally a quiet and private matter, becomes a prism through which every past and future decision is refracted. And in that refracted light, contradictions emerge, tensions mount, and the human story, the one of love, protection, fear, and hope, complicates every headline. The question lingers, uncomfortably. How will Harry navigate this storm? Will he respond publicly or retreat further into privacy? Will the adoption claim be framed as protective, strategic, or something else entirely? And perhaps most importantly, how will the world interpret what is said, unsaid, and implied? Because in this story, words are weapons, silence is conspicuous, and every gesture carries weight far beyond the immediate moment. There are also whispers of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that suggest even deeper complications. Advisors reportedly debated whether to issue statements, leak counter-narratives, or simply let the story settle. Friends close to the Sussexes expressed frustration that decisions made privately are now interpreted publicly, often with distortion. The palace, meanwhile, maintains its customary reserve, neither confirming nor denying specifics, yet quietly attentive to the reverberations. Every actor in this unfolding narrative operates under pressure, expectation, and sometimes fear, aware that even the smallest misstep can have outsized consequences. And then there is the wider context. Harry's life has always been a study in contradiction, a prince who rejects certain royal conventions yet embraces others. A husband and father navigating global fame, a man whose personal choices are inseparable from public expectation. The adoption revelation does not simply fit into this existing tension, it amplifies it. It demands reassessment, reflection, and, inevitably, reaction. What makes the story even more compelling, almost unbearably so, is what remains unknown. How did the decision for adoption come about? Was it preemptive, protective, or reactive? Were all parties fully aware, fully consenting, fully prepared for the implications? And crucially, what does this mean for Lilibet herself, who is, in the midst of this global scrutiny, the central figure in a narrative she cannot yet control? Questions proliferate, layering one over another. Who else knew? How widely has this information circulated before hitting Bauer's pages? What conversations occurred quietly in rooms far from public view? And who, if anyone, authorized their release? Each question multiplies uncertainty, and each layer of ambiguity fuels public curiosity. In a world obsessed with certainty and clarity, the lack of definitive answers becomes almost unbearable. And just as we think we might begin to piece together the motives and implications, another layer emerges, the timing relative to other public events. Why reveal this now? Was it designed to coincide with other narratives surrounding the Sussexes, creating maximum impact? Or is it, as some insiders speculate, the culmination of a longer investigation that only now reached its public phase? The complexity is staggering, and the human stakes, family, identity, reputation, cannot be overstated. The chapter closes on an uncomfortable observation. In a life defined by both privilege and scrutiny, privacy becomes a paradoxical currency. The more one attempts to protect it, the more it seems to attract attention. The more carefully decisions are made in private, the more their eventual revelation carries shock, speculation, and consequence. And in this context, Harry faces not just a personal reckoning, but a public one, a challenge to navigate the fallout of a revelation that is as emotionally charged as it is globally consequential. But as the world digests the claim and advisors weigh options, a chilling thought lingers. If this revelation has shaken even the most private corners of Harry's life, what else might still lie beneath the surface? What truths remain hidden, waiting for the right, or wrong, moment to emerge? Because in the shadowed intersection of family, media, and monarchy, one revelation is never the end. It is merely the beginning. And just as that thought settles, another emerges. The leak is only the opening act. What comes next will be watched, scrutinized, and dissected by millions. And it may force Harry and the world to confront realities that were once considered untouchable. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. How do you process a revelation that lands like a thunderbolt in your own life? For Prince Harry, the leak about Lilibet's adoption was not just a headline. It was a deeply personal intrusion. Behind the carefully curated public appearances, beyond the smiles and polished statements, a private reckoning was underway. One that few, if any, would witness directly. The tension in those private moments was almost tangible, described by sources as heavy, suffocating, and relentless. Imagine standing in your own living room, reading words that redefine not only your child's story, but also the story you have spent years protecting. Advisors recount scenes of urgency, almost cinematic in their intensity. Phones ringing incessantly, messages pinging across encrypted channels, meetings called at odd hours. It was a coordinated effort to assess, to respond, and perhaps to contain what had already spiraled beyond containment. And yet, containment seemed almost impossible. Once a claim like this enters the public sphere, it is not easily withdrawn, nor is it ever seen in isolation. Each detail is magnified, dissected, and reframed. The leak wasn't just about. Analysts, commentators, and even casual observers leapt to interpret what the palace was, or wasn't, saying. Social media erupted, threads dissected prior statements, old interviews were revisited for nuance, and news cycles amplified uncertainty. In effect, the absence of comment became a story of its own. What makes this scenario particularly complex is the layered hierarchy of influence within the palace. Decisions regarding public messaging are rarely unilateral. Senior advisors, communication strategists, legal counsel, and even select family members contribute input. Consensus is sought, but in crises of this nature, consensus can be elusive. Every participant brings a mix of caution, ambition, and personal perspective. And when the matter is both intimate and highly public, achieving alignment becomes a delicate, often frustrating, negotiation. The human element is undeniable. Courtiers reportedly watched Harry's reaction closely, understanding that his emotional state would inevitably shape the broader narrative. For many, the adoption revelation was more than a media challenge. It was a personal concern. Questions of trust, loyalty, and family dynamics came to the fore. How would Harry respond? How would Meghan interpret the palace's approach? Would private grievances escalate into public confrontation? Every actor in this scenario had to navigate not just the factual, but the emotional terrain. Some insiders suggest that senior family members were caught off guard by the leak. While the Sussexes' departure from traditional royal roles has long prompted speculation, the precise nature of the adoption claim reportedly introduced an element of surprise. There were quiet conversations about prior awareness, previous discussions, and what, if anything, could have been anticipated or prevented. Even within a structure built on centuries of precedent, unpredictability remains inevitable. Meanwhile, the media landscape compounded the pressure. News outlets worldwide framed the story differently. Some emphasized the scandalous potential, others focused on the human and emotional dimensions, and a subset attempted a sober analysis of historical context and precedent. This proliferation of perspectives meant that any palace response would have to navigate not just factual accuracy, but public sentiment, narrative framing, and potential backlash. The margin for error was microscopic. Psychologically, the palace faces a paradox. They must protect both their institution and the individuals within it. The adoption claim places Harry, and by extension, the royal family, at the intersection of private concern and public scrutiny. Protecting a child's privacy while maintaining institutional authority is a challenge compounded by the speed and volume of modern information dissemination. Every private conversation has the potential to leak, every strategic decision can be misinterpreted, and every action carries symbolic weight beyond its immediate context. Legal considerations also entered the calculus. Advisors debated the potential consequences of acknowledging, denying, or reframing the claim. Were there precedents for addressing private family matters publicly? Could silence be construed as tacit acknowledgement? Were there legal protections or challenges that could be invoked to mitigate fallout? Each question carried the potential for unintended consequences, magnifying the intensity of decision-making. Emotionally, observers note that even seasoned advisors felt the strain. For decades, the palace has managed crises ranging from financial scandals to public relations missteps. Yet few events touch the deeply personal with such immediacy. The adoption claim is not a corporate misstep or a protocol violation. It is an intimate revelation about a child, a parent, and a family navigating global attention. Managing it required balancing empathy, strategy, and long-term reputation management simultaneously. Then there is the public perception factor. In today's environment, the line between private family matters and public discourse is blurred. Social media amplifies every whisper, commentary, and interpretation. For the palace, the adoption claim is not just a narrative to manage. It is an ongoing conversation they cannot fully control. Each reaction, from hashtags to opinion columns, influences perception. Every delay, clarification, or lack thereof becomes an interpretive signal. The stakes, already high, are now amplified exponentially. At the same time, there are subtle indicators that palace staff recognize the emotional complexity for Harry. Sources describe careful framing, attempts to provide private support, and efforts to manage external exposure without further inflaming speculation. Yet, even these gestures must contend with the realities of global attention. The private calculus of care and concern intersects with the public calculus of authority, influence, and perception. And then there is the historical context. Adoption within royal and aristocratic circles carries unique symbolic weight. It intersects with notions of lineage, inheritance, and legitimacy that have long influenced public perception and internal governance. The palace must navigate not only the current emotional and media challenges, but the potential long-term implications for precedent, perception, and institutional integrity. Finally, consider the tension of human behavior under pressure. Sources indicate moments of conflict, hesitation, and reflection among advisors and family members alike. Small disagreements over messaging, tone, or timing became magnified, each one representing a microcosm of the broader challenge, balancing personal care, institutional duty, and public scrutiny. In a scenario defined by uncertainty, even minor decisions carry disproportionate weight. As night falls in London, the palace remains a study in contrasts. Quiet corridors filled with whispered consultations, tension-heavy discussions, and an undercurrent of concern for both family and institution. Publicly, silence dominates. Privately, deliberation is relentless. And all the while, the leak continues to reverberate, forcing reconsideration of strategy, perception, and family dynamics. Yet, even with these extensive efforts at damage control, one question remains unresolved, persistent, and ominous. If the palace struggles to maintain authority in the wake of a single revelation, what happens when the next, potentially even more disruptive truth emerges? The moment Bauer's claim went public, the story exploded. Headlines splintered across continents. Prince Harry faces adoption controversy. Lilibet, the secret the world didn't know. Sussexes under fire? Social media ignited almost instantly, trending hashtags multiplying by the hour. Twitter threads dissected phrases, Instagram stories speculated on timing, and YouTube commentators began crafting reaction videos, each one interpreting the revelation through their own lens. For Harry and Meghan, the storm was not just about the claim itself. It was about the velocity and intensity with which it spread. One striking feature of this public surge was the contradiction embedded in audience reactions. Some viewers expressed empathy, praising the couple for maintaining family privacy under extraordinary scrutiny. Others, however, framed it as scandalous, a breach of transparency, or even a manipulation of narrative. The diversity of reaction was dizzying, reflecting the fractured nature of modern media consumption. In other words, Harry was facing multiple narratives simultaneously, some sympathetic, some hostile, all amplified. Analysts note that the speed of modern news cycles exacerbates this tension. Stories are written, shared, and reinterpreted within minutes, often before official responses can be drafted. Every delay, no matter how brief, is interpreted as hesitancy, ambiguity, or even guilt. For high-profile figures like Harry, the challenge is compounded by the dual roles he inhabits: private father and public figure. Protecting Lilibet's privacy while navigating global commentary is a task few parents can imagine, and fewer can execute under such pressure. The role of social media platforms cannot be overstated. Memes, posts, and threads circulated almost instantaneously, each adding new context or misinformation to the narrative. Commentators and influencers dissected Bauer's claim, speculated about palace reactions, and offered their own theories about motives and consequences. The narrative became a multi-layered, decentralized conversation in which Harry had little direct control. Observers noted that every attempt to frame or clarify information risked being distorted, misinterpreted, or misrepresented. At the same time, traditional media outlets added their own analysis, often amplifying contradictions or highlighting speculation. Newspapers across Europe, North America, and beyond framed the story differently. Some emphasized the emotional and human aspects, focusing on parental concerns and privacy issues. Others emphasized the sensational elements, questioning lineage, transparency, and legacy. For the global audience, interpretation depended as much on the outlet as on the content itself, creating a kaleidoscope of narratives, many conflicting, some inflammatory. This multifaceted media environment created intense pressure for Harry. Even minor missteps, taken out of context, could fuel further headlines, prolonging attention and heightening scrutiny. Sources describe an atmosphere of near-constant vigilance, with advisors monitoring media output, social media trends, and public sentiment around the clock. The combination of immediacy and breadth made traditional approaches to crisis management nearly obsolete. In this landscape, speed was critical, yet every reaction required careful calibration. Complicating matters further were the contradictions inherent in public expectations. On one hand, the public demanded transparency and explanation. On the other, there was a vocal subset advocating for privacy and protection. Harry and Meghan found themselves navigating this paradox. The need to protect Lilibet clashed with the expectation of public disclosure. Every statement, every social media post, every interview excerpt was scrutinized for intent, tone, and implication. In other words, every action became both protective measure and potential provocation. Insiders also note the emotional toll of this exposure. Social media commentary is not abstract. It is immediate, raw, and unfiltered. Friends and family reported that Harry was closely following threads, not necessarily to engage, but to gauge public reaction. The emotional weight of reading interpretations, judgments, and speculations about one's own child is immense, particularly when compounded by the knowledge that these narratives are shaping global perception in real time. The media frenzy was further intensified by the framing of adoption as controversial. While adoption in most contexts is neutral or even positive, its juxtaposition with royal lineage created an inherently sensational angle. Media outlets, whether intentionally or inadvertently, amplified contradictions: privacy versus public scrutiny, love versus perceived secrecy, protection versus transparency. The resulting narrative was highly charged, emotionally compelling, and inherently unstable. Analysts also observed the international dimension of the story. Coverage was not limited to the UK or North America. Global outlets seized upon the revelation, each framing it according to local perceptions of royalty, privacy, and family. In some regions, emphasis was placed on protocol, heritage, and lineage. In others, the human interest angle dominated. This global amplification ensured that no single narrative could dominate completely, creating a fragmented but intense media landscape. Public engagement was also shaped by timing. The leak coincided with other high-profile media events, social debates, and political discussions, which intersected in ways that heightened attention. In modern media ecosystems, stories are rarely isolated. They interact, compound, and amplify each other. This convergence magnified the adoption revelation, ensuring that it would dominate discussion not for hours, but potentially days, weeks, or longer. In response, the Sussexes media team reportedly implemented a continuous monitoring strategy, tracking social sentiment, trending topics, and emergent narratives. They coordinated rapid response mechanisms, drafted clarifying statements, and prepared potential interviews, all while weighing the emotional and psychological impact on Harry, Meghan, and Lilibet. Every effort was calculated, yet the rapid and decentralized nature of modern media made perfect control impossible. The contradictions in public reaction were striking. Empathy and outrage existed side by side. Curiosity and criticism overlapped. Social media became a digital arena in which facts, speculation, emotion, and agenda collided. For Harry, observing this dynamic must have felt disorienting. The story had life beyond his influence, yet he remained inexorably linked to it. Every detail, every interpretation, every viral comment carried personal and reputational consequences. And still, even amid the chaos, the story was evolving. Analysts predicted that further revelations, whether from Tom Bower, palace insiders, or other sources, could emerge at any moment, prolonging public attention and heightening uncertainty. The adoption claim was only the first layer, and the potential for deeper narrative development remained significant. The emotional dimension of the public storm cannot be understated. Friends describe Harry experiencing a combination of frustration, protectiveness, and determination. Protecting Lilibet from undue scrutiny, managing his own public image, and maintaining family privacy simultaneously required constant vigilance, reflection, and strategic judgment. In this environment, even minor personal interactions could carry global weight, reinforcing the relentless pressure under which the Sussexes operate. Meanwhile, social media commentary continued to shape perceptions. Even seemingly minor interpretations or misrepresentations were amplified, feeding a feedback loop in which public discussion influenced both media framing and internal deliberations. The complexity of navigating such a landscape, while protecting one's child and maintaining dignity, is difficult to overstate. And as the world debated, analyzed, and speculated, one reality remained undeniable. The adoption revelation was no longer a private matter. It had entered a global conversation that would not easily recede. Every response, every silence, every perceived gesture was being scrutinized, analyzed, and interpreted, ensuring that the narrative remained alive and dynamic. But amid the headlines, hashtags, and viral commentary, an even more pressing question emerged. If the public storm is this intense, how much more remains concealed, and when, or if? Will the next layer of revelation surface? When a revelation of this magnitude surfaces, it doesn't just affect the principal figures. It ripples through every relationship, every alliance, and every hidden tension in a family network. For Harry, the leak about Lilibet's adoption triggered not only public upheaval, but also private reckonings. Friends, confidants, advisors, and even distant relatives suddenly found themselves pulled into the gravity of a story they never anticipated. Trust, loyalty, and strategy collided behind closed doors, revealing fractures as well as alliances that had quietly existed for years. Sources describe a sudden flurry of communications within Harry's inner circle immediately after the leak. Close friends reportedly spent hours on video calls, weighing options, offering counsel, and sometimes simply venting shared frustration. There was disbelief, concern, and a growing sense of urgency. How to manage the emotional fallout for Lilibet while simultaneously navigating a narrative that now had global attention. The conversation was delicate. Every word carried weight. One misstep could exacerbate the public perception problem, or worse, complicate private dynamics. But tension wasn't limited to friends. Advisors were reportedly divided in their approach. Some advocated for immediate, proactive clarification. A carefully worded statement, a controlled interview, or even strategic media appearances to frame the narrative. Others urged caution, arguing that any engagement could magnify the story, risking misinterpretation and extending its life cycle in the public eye. In that room of conflicting advice, Harry's role was both participant and observer. The responsibility to protect Lilibet's privacy sat uneasily beside the demands of managing public perception, creating a high-stakes balancing act that few outside the inner circle could appreciate. Family relationships, too, were tested. Sources suggest subtle friction arose between senior royal figures and the Sussexes, primarily around questions of timing and messaging. Did anyone anticipate this claim? Was there prior knowledge? Were warnings given or ignored? Even within a family trained for centuries in protocol and discretion, the emotional and strategic implications of such a revelation introduced uncertainty and strain. Trust, both institutional and personal, was suddenly at a premium, fragile and carefully measured. The leak also exposed divisions between allies and potential adversaries. Those considered loyal may have provided guidance, emotional support, or strategic insight. Meanwhile, peripheral figures, whether by circumstance or personal agendas, were perceived as more detached, possibly even opportunistic. The very act of positioning oneself as an ally carried risk. Overstepping, misjudging the timing, or misreading the emotional temperature could inadvertently worsen the situation. In this high-pressure environment, every gesture, message, and consultation was scrutinized, evaluated, and weighed for its consequences. At the same time, new alliances reportedly began to form. Individuals who had previously remained neutral or distanced suddenly became active participants, offering insights, connections, or interventions to help navigate the fallout. These alliances were sometimes pragmatic, sometimes emotional, and occasionally strategic, a mix of support, influence, and self-preservation. In other words, the leak didn't merely disrupt existing structures. It catalyzed a reshuffling of relational dynamics, forcing people to reconsider loyalties, priorities, and influence. Adding another layer of complexity, advisors considered not just immediate responses, but long-term ramifications. Every decision made in the aftermath of the leak would ripple forward, shaping public perception, internal dynamics, and potential future disclosures. The timing of statements, the framing of explanations, and even the order in which information was shared were analyzed meticulously. This was not a matter of casual discussion. It was a multidimensional strategic exercise where the personal, institutional, and public spheres converged. Yet, emotional complexity continued to influence decisions. Friends and confidants observed Harry oscillating between protective instincts, frustration at exposure, and reflective contemplation. The personal stakes were profound: a child's privacy, a family's dignity, and a parent's own emotional equilibrium all intersected with global scrutiny. And even as advisors focused on strategy, Harry's emotional and ethical considerations could not be fully managed or contained by tactical planning alone. One particularly delicate element was the question of public allies versus private advisors. Who could be trusted to act in Lilibet's best interests? Who might inadvertently or deliberately contribute to narrative distortion? Sources suggest that this distinction created constant tension within Harry's network. Each action was measured not just for immediate impact, but for potential downstream consequences. Misjudging a relationship, misunderstanding an ally's motives, or misreading public sentiment could all compound the challenge exponentially. The internal calculus also had to account for adversaries. Not necessarily enemies, but those whose actions, statements, or inactions could intensify scrutiny. In the context of a high-profile revelation, even minor criticisms, leaks, or speculative commentary could be weaponized. The leak about Lilibet's adoption was already a potent catalyst. Any further friction within the inner circle could magnify it. Sources indicate that Harry's advisors were acutely aware of these dynamics, carefully monitoring both allies and potential adversaries to anticipate and mitigate risks. Beyond personal relationships, there were broader strategic considerations. Media narratives were evolving in real time, and every ally, advisor, or friend became a potential conduit, whether intentionally or not, for information that could influence public perception. This dynamic introduced subtle pressures. Loyalty was constantly tested, discretion was paramount, and the consequences of misjudgment were amplified by the global stage. The inner circle was not just a support network, it was a front line in the battle over narrative control. Even as relationships were tested, the leak also highlighted moments of human empathy and solidarity. Friends reportedly rallied privately to provide emotional support, reinforce decision-making frameworks, and offer practical solutions for managing both media scrutiny and internal family concerns. These gestures, while discreet, were critical to maintaining some semblance of stability amid the whirlwind of public speculation. At the same time, internal conflicts continued to simmer. Some insiders expressed frustration that decisions made in private were now subject to public interpretation. Differences in perspective, priorities, and risk tolerance created subtle but consequential fissures within the inner circle. These tensions required constant mediation, careful framing, and, at times, temporary restraint, holding back impulses in order to preserve long-term cohesion. In navigating these relational complexities, Harry reportedly engaged in deliberate reflection, considering not only immediate impact, but also long-term consequences for family dynamics, personal relationships, and public perception. The process was described as painstaking, emotionally taxing, and unrelenting. The adoption revelation had become more than a public scandal. It was a crucible for testing loyalty, judgment, and resilience within the network that surrounded him. And then there was the question of messaging. How to coordinate public statements with private reassurance. How to ensure that every ally understood the delicate balance between transparency, privacy, and emotional sensitivity. This was a logistical and psychological challenge, one that demanded precision, patience, and constant vigilance. Every miscommunication, every misinterpretation could have outsized consequences in the media, the court of public opinion, and the family itself. The chapter closes with a sobering realization. In a crisis of this nature, allies and adversaries are rarely fixed. Relationships shift, priorities realign, and influence fluctuates with every development. The leak about Lilibet's adoption did not merely disrupt narrative control, it disrupted relational equilibrium. And for Harry, navigating these ever-changing dynamics would require not only strategy, but empathy, insight, and unrelenting attention to both the personal and the public. But even as alliances were tested and adversaries observed, an unsettling question remained. With so many moving parts, how could Harry ensure that the next revelation, whatever it might be, would not fracture the delicate balance he was struggling to moss? The news of Lilibet's adoption traveled beyond the UK. The story assumed a global dimension, one that few could have anticipated. From North America to Europe, Asia, and beyond, media outlets dissected, debated, and dramatized the claim, each cultural and political context adding its own layer of interpretation. For Harry and Meghan, the adoption revelation was no longer a domestic concern. It had become an international event, subject to cross-continental scrutiny that magnified both stakes and consequences. In the United States, where the Sussexes have largely relocated, coverage was relentless. Major networks devoted segments to analysis, while cable channels invited commentators to speculate on the implications for public perception, media strategy, and even celebrity status. Social media amplified every word. Clips from news broadcasts, snippets of commentary, and viral threads all converged, creating a saturation effect that made it difficult for even casual observers to avoid the narrative. Insiders report that Harry's team monitored this media barrage with meticulous attention, aware that global audiences would interpret every nuance differently. Europe presented a different challenge. In regions where monarchy and heritage carry symbolic weight, the adoption claim sparked debates about lineage, legacy, and legitimacy. Analysts, commentators, and editorial boards dissected historical precedents, comparing Lilibet's situation to prior royal adoptions or secretive family arrangements. Even in countries with minimal direct interest in the Sussexes, social media and news syndication ensured that the story spread rapidly, often accompanied by local interpretations that further complicated global messaging. Asia and other regions added yet another layer of complexity. In some markets, the story was framed less as a familial revelation and more as a cultural phenomenon, a case study in how Western royalty navigates private and public life. Media outlets juxtaposed the adoption claim with broader discussions of celebrity privacy, media ethics, and family dynamics. This international lens created both opportunities and risks. It offered a platform to frame the narrative positively, yet also exposed the family to interpretations beyond their control. Across all regions, there was a common thread. Global audiences reacted with intensity, fascination, and contradiction. Some expressed empathy, highlighting the challenges of parenting under constant surveillance. Others focused on scandal, lineage, and perceived secrecy. The contrast in interpretation highlighted a fundamental reality. Harry and Meghan's personal choices were now being interpreted through diverse cultural lenses, each carrying its own biases, expectations, and assumptions. The immediacy of global reactions amplified the pressure on the Sussexes communications team. Every news cycle demanded attention, every viral trend required monitoring, and every public discussion had the potential to influence perception in other markets. Traditional PR strategies proved insufficient for a story that was simultaneously domestic, international, and instantaneous. Advisors reportedly debated the merits of direct statements, controlled interviews, or strategic silence, all while weighing cultural implications and audience reception across continents. International scrutiny also heightened emotional stakes. Sources describe Harry as acutely aware that reactions outside the UK were shaped not only by curiosity, but by symbolic associations with monarchy, heritage, and privacy. The adoption revelation was no longer just about family. It had become a lens through which the world evaluated trust, authenticity, and identity. Every action, every pause, every public appearance carried consequences far beyond immediate perception. Legal and strategic considerations intensified on the global stage. International media coverage created scenarios in which different jurisdictions could interpret statements differently, raising concerns about defamation, privacy, and the potential for misrepresentation. Advisors reportedly analyzed each region's media landscape, weighing the likelihood of amplification, distortion, and long-term impact. The adoption revelation was no longer contained. It had become a complex, multi-layered crisis that demanded coordination across time zones, cultures, and media ecosystems. Even within social media, global reactions added unexpected dimensions. Viral discussions, memes, and commentary threads cross-pollinated across regions, creating an information network that was decentralized, dynamic, and difficult to influence. Insights from analytics teams reportedly highlighted trends in public sentiment, highlighting areas where clarification might be necessary and regions where silence could be strategically advantageous. Yet, even with data, prediction remained uncertain. Human interpretation, emotion, and cultural nuance ensured that reactions would remain unpredictable. The international dimension also highlighted contradictions. Some global audiences expressed admiration for the Sussexes' efforts to protect family privacy, while others criticized them for perceived opacity or secrecy. Some focused on the human story, the challenges of parenthood under media scrutiny, while others emphasized symbolic implications for lineage and identity. These contradictions created a multifaceted landscape in which the adoption revelation was simultaneously a private concern, a public spectacle, and a cultural touchstone. The intensity of global scrutiny had tangible implications for Harry and Meghan. Scheduling, travel, and public appearances required reconsideration, as advisors assessed how each move might interact with ongoing narratives. Emotional stress reportedly increased, as the couple navigated an environment in which every decision had amplified visibility and consequence. Sources describe late-night discussions about messaging, tone, and timing, underscoring the relentless nature of global attention. Moreover, international reactions magnified secondary effects. Public discourse in one country often influenced media framing in another, creating a feedback loop in which coverage multiplied and evolved continuously. Advisors faced the challenge of maintaining coherent messaging while responding to evolving interpretations, balancing the need for accuracy with strategic discretion. In essence, the adoption claim had created a global narrative ecosystem that was dynamic, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. This global scrutiny also revealed unexpected alliances and rivalries. Some international journalists expressed cautious admiration for the Sussexes' discretion, while others framed the adoption revelation as indicative of secrecy or obfuscation. Public opinion polls in certain countries suggested mixed sentiment, reflecting both empathy and suspicion. Harry and Meghan were now operating in a landscape where domestic considerations were inseparable from global perception. a reality that intensified both pressure and stakes. Despite careful management, uncertainty persisted. International audiences were not a monolith, and media ecosystems differed significantly in approach, bias, and responsiveness. The adoption claim had transformed from a private matter into a global narrative challenge, one that required constant vigilance, nuanced strategy, and emotional resilience. For Harry, the pressure was cumulative. Managing family, media, and public sentiment across continents demanded both strategic acumen and personal fortitude. And as global discussions continued to unfold, an unsettling realization emerged. The adoption revelation was only one thread in a larger narrative tapestry. Behind it lay additional uncertainties, hidden dimensions, and potential future disclosures. Every international headline, every trending topic, every viral post was a reminder that control over the story remained fragile. But even amid this worldwide scrutiny, one question looms larger than any headline or tweet. If the world is watching this closely, what else has yet to surface? And when it does, how will Harry and the global audience respond? The global attention, the media frenzy, the palace strategizing, it all converged on Harry in a way that few could truly comprehend. Behind closed doors, away from cameras, headlines, and social media feeds, the weight of the adoption revelation pressed heavily. Sources describe long evenings where he walked the rooms of his home, a mixture of anxiety, reflection, and quiet anger etched on his face. It wasn't just the claim itself, it was the public intrusion into his most private world. The private toll was complex. Harry reportedly oscillated between anger at the exposure and deep concern for Lilibet's well-being. Protecting a child from public scrutiny is challenging under normal circumstances. Under global surveillance, it becomes almost impossible. Every phone call, every message, every potential media interaction had to be carefully considered, filtered through the dual lens of parental instinct and strategic necessity. Insiders describe moments where he would pause, staring at walls, processing how a single revelation had reverberated through both his private and public life. Meghan's presence added both support and complexity. Friends note that she was intensely protective, insisting on careful boundaries and private discussions. Her role was simultaneously emotional anchor and strategic partner. The couple reportedly spent hours weighing possible reactions, what to say, what to withhold, how to shield Lilibet without inflaming the story further. Emotional labor was constant, and the intensity of global attention amplified the stakes. Even small miscalculations could have outsized consequences. Isolation reportedly became a feature of Harry's days. While surrounded by trusted advisors, the pressure created a sense of solitude. Few could fully grasp the intersection of global scrutiny and parental concern. Friends describe calls at odd hours, discussions that went late into the night, and moments where even the most confident advisors sensed that the emotional burden was unusually high. It wasn't just strategy. It was the weight of defending family identity in a world ready to judge, speculate, and amplify every nuance. The emotional toll was compounded by uncertainty. Not only did Harry have to contend with the adoption revelation itself, but he also had to anticipate the ripple effects, how media outlets would frame responses, how the palace might interpret reactions, how global audiences would perceive every gesture or statement. In such an environment, even silence carries meaning, often interpreted through bias, expectation, or assumption. Every decision became a psychological calculus of risk versus protection. Sleep reportedly suffered. Advisors and friends described nights of interrupted rest, reflective pauses, and the persistent hum of anxiety that comes with knowing that private matters have entered the public arena. The revelation had turned normal domestic life into a high-stakes stage, where every conversation, every interaction, and every moment of quiet could have external consequences. Friends also described moments of vulnerability, where Harry expressed frustration at the relentless attention. It wasn't merely concern over perception. It was the emotional labor of navigating parenthood under a microscope. He reportedly wrestled with guilt, questioning whether there was more he could have done to protect his family's privacy, and whether the media scrutiny could ever be fully managed. This internal tension, between parental instinct and public pressure, was pervasive, shaping both personal behavior and strategic decision-making. The pressure extended to Lilibet herself. While she remains young and shielded as much as possible, sources indicate that Harry and Meghan were deeply concerned about her exposure to media speculation and public commentary. Decisions about schooling, outings, and public appearances were suddenly fraught with new considerations. Every moment required weighing the benefits of normalcy against the potential risks of attention, a delicate and emotionally taxing balancing act. This stress, combined with the global spotlight, reportedly created friction even among close allies. Small disagreements over strategy, messaging, and timing sometimes escalated, though always under careful management. Even in a circle of trusted advisors, emotional pressure is contagious. The high stakes of the situation intensified normal tensions, making every decision feel heavier, every discussion more consequential. One particularly challenging aspect was the unpredictability of media reactions. Harry reportedly monitored threads, news reports, and social media trends, not to fuel anxiety, but to anticipate potential narrative trajectories. Yet, even with careful analysis, the pace and complexity of information flow meant that surprises were inevitable. Misinterpretations, distortions, and speculative narratives multiplied faster than any official response could manage. The emotional toll was also intertwined with strategic calculation. Harry was acutely aware that any visible sign of emotional strain could be interpreted as weakness or complicity. Maintaining composure, while managing the internal turmoil of concern for Lilibet and frustration with the media, became a constant performance. It was not a performance for public applause. It was a survival mechanism, a way to maintain credibility, control, and dignity under unprecedented scrutiny. Sources describe moments where he would retreat into quiet reflection, processing both the human and symbolic dimensions of the leak. Adoption, though an act of love, had become a prism through which lineage, identity, and public perception were refracted. Protecting Lilibet's privacy was no longer a simple family concern. It was entangled with global perception, media framing, and historical narrative. Every decision, every action, every gesture carried weight far beyond the immediate context. Emotionally, the revelation challenged fundamental assumptions about control, safety, and agency. Harry reportedly wrestled with feelings of vulnerability, frustration, and determination. The adoption claim had shifted the parameters of his personal and familial world, forcing him to reconcile the need for protection with the realities of public exposure. He faced a constant internal dialogue: how much to shield, how much to respond, how much to anticipate. And always, the presence of global attention complicated every choice. The chapter closes with a quiet, unsettling truth. Even the most private moments were no longer fully private. Every reaction, every pause, every expression became part of the story. And as Harry continued to navigate this emotional landscape, one question remained unanswered and pressing. If this revelation has already fractured normalcy so profoundly, what happens when the next layer of truth, hidden, deliberate, or accidental, emerges? Behind the emotional and personal turmoil lay another dimension: legal and strategic considerations that had suddenly become urgent. Sources close to Harry describe a flurry of consultations with legal advisors, communication strategists, and senior aides, all working to anticipate both immediate and long-term consequences of Bauer's adoption claim. Every word, every potential statement, every public gesture had to be weighed against risk to reputation, risk to family privacy, and risk of legal complications. The calculus was relentless, exacting, and exhausting. Legal advisors reportedly focused first on clarifying the nature